so that there cannot be a new agreement until after the election.
It was late yesterday afternoon, British Parliament have voted and agreed to remove the so-called Irish backstop from its Brexit deal. However, as it is said, it is unlikely that changes will be made that the EU will accept that. More on these stories can be found at townhall.com.
The following is an American Matters media production. The views expressed do not necessarily represent those of the station or its advertisers, although we think they should. But that's the opinion of American Matters Media.
Hello and welcome again to Talking Truth to Power, Reno's Freedom Talk Radio. I am your co-host, Brendan Trainor, and along with me is Leland Faegre, and on Skype.
And we have
Jennifer Terhune Green coming in on Skype from that liberal bastion in the northwest Seattle.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello, happy to be here. How are you guys this morning?
Good. We're glad you're here with us.
Yes, so this is a new time zone, time slot for us. These 11 to noon on Wednesdays, and our host here at the radio station says it's an excellent time slot because all the secretaries start putting their earplugs in at this time. I don't know whether that's true, but we welcome any of our new listeners, and we've been on the air. We were off the air for a while, but basically since 2016, 15, with the variant of the show. And we're basically, we are liberty-oriented show that we talk about current affairs, domestic and foreign. Not too many shows talk about foreign policy as much as we do, but it's basically about the concept of promoting freedom, individual rights, much less government, much lower taxes, and replacing them with ideas that the major two parties probably don't like to talk about as much. Do you have any thoughts on our show's philosophy, Jennifer?
Oh, I agree with what you've said, absolutely. And I also like to think of Talking Truth to Power as a show where we can talk about all topics, including those that are taboo and maybe not politically correct or outside of the mainstream discussion.
Perfect,
We're definitely not locked inside the mainstream media box here. We talk about all the stuff that we think is important, and I'm very proud of this show and the voice of freedom, and I think we strive really hard to tell the truth as we see it, and that is unfortunately pretty rare.
Yeah, and we go into areas that nobody else touches. So it's really an interesting program.
Okay.
If I do say so myself.
All right.
I second that opinion.
So, all right. Well, let's get started. And one thing, I guess we could start with the biggest news of the week since we were on, was the decision by Donald Trump to stop the government shutdown and to bring back the government employees. And it was, in my opinion, a defeat, although the Republicans are trying to cast it as a maneuver to a new situation. But I think, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, that the Democrats still hold the advantage here. And what do you think? Do you think this was a win, and we're going to keep winning for Donald, or is this not such a win at all?
Leland, you can go ahead and take that.
Well, I think it's a tactical retreat. I think in negotiation, whether it's military or civil, these kinds of things are necessary in order to continue your agenda, whatever it happens to be. And I've seen some statistics this morning that indicate that actually it looks better for Trump than it does for the Democrats.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah. First of all, he's maintained his national rating for the most part, mid-40s in that vicinity. And her numbers are way, way down into the 20s. And, of course, people have a very less than affection for the United States Congress, and the numbers prove that, way down into the teens in some cases. So I don't think it's as clear as the media would like you to believe it is, that he, took a black eye during the having to concede to Nancy Pelosi.
Okay, and what about the effect on freedom overall? I mean, this has cost the government a good deal of money, and therefore, when the government loses money, the taxpayers lose money. And one of the ominous results of
Well, that number was $11 billion.
Yeah, 11.
That's a pittance for...
Well, yeah, it's twice as much as the wall.
And I'm sure, well, no, it'll end up being about $11 billion by the time it's completed. But I think that kind of money can be made back very, very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And but the other thing is this move now to guarantee federal workers their paychecks, even if there's another shutdown, which would make the effect of the shutdown, even a government shutdown, even less so important to the opposition of such a shutdown. And this idolization of government workers is also troubling, that they are just so great and we love them and we're going to give them all the money that's their due with interest. And yet most of these jobs could have been easily replaced or, or farmed out to another service, or in the case of the air traffic controllers, it should have been privatized years ago.
Absolutely, that's where this should have gone. I think for us to have really claimed victory here. I think if it.
I agree, and I think that the discussion of essential versus non-essential federal government workers is a discussion we need to have, and it seems like a very strange classification why they weren't paying, for instance, the air traffic controllers. And I agree that if we had, privatized that like it should have been a long time ago, as well as airplane security too.
Yes.
I mean, those are important jobs, and why those are not being paid or not considered non-essential, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, security experts will tell you the greatest increase in security after 9/11 was making sure the doors to the cockpit were securely locked so terrorists can't get into the cockpit. And number two, this information given to passengers that sometimes they have to get up and subdue somebody on their own. Mm-hmm. And those were the two greatest security measures taken, and none of them have to do with TSA and, all the other aspects that go around with increased scrutiny of people's ID and everything else.
I think one of the things that I took from in the aftermath of the 9/11 event was that Norman Mineta, the Democrat, was selected to be the transportation secretary, and he refused to permit pilots to carry guns.
Yes.
I thought that was the most mindless thing I've ever heard.
Yes.
And I guess we're up against the break. We'll see you in a few minutes.
The Butcher's Kitchen Barbecue invites your family in for the best wood-fire, slow-cooked barbecue rotisserie and open char.
This is America Matters Media on AM 1180 KCKQ, a Lotus broadcast station. The power of radio since 1967.
Want to expand your advertising dollar? Sponsor this or any America Matters program by calling 775-827-8900, extension 2. Now back to the show.
Hello and welcome back to Talking Truth to Power. I'm your co-host, Brendan Trainor, along with Leland Faegre and Jennifer Terhune Green. And we were talking about the end of the government shutdown, basically. And I would like to raise a little point about immigration that I came across. And I was feeling this, but I was intuitively understanding that there was something wrong with the debate. And then it's been written up with economic graphs, and I can pretty much understand economic graphs, so it brought it home to me. But this idea and I love Tucker Carlson when he's talking about foreign policy, but when he gets into immigration, I have questions about his presentation. But this idea that immigration hurts more immigrants depress wages of American workers. And what is the truth behind that? And
it makes perfectly good sense empirically.
Well, not empirically even.
Sure.
No, if you look at Miami, it doesn't.
Well, how so?
Miami had many more immigrants after as Cuban refugees, and their wages have stayed the same or gone up.
Well, again, I'd like to see the numbers on that. But
Yeah.
Intuitively, if you understand liberty and free markets, if you introduce a price that's underscoring or taking advantage of existing prices, then you're going to get some depression in either price or wages. And
Yep.
that,
What about the theory of, supply and demand? If you have an overabundance of supply and labor, wouldn't that cause the wages to go down because there's more people looking for work?
yeah, that seems to be the
Well,
intuitive understanding.
That is the intuitive understanding, and whenever a politician says it's just common sense, I scratch my head and say, I don't know. Common sense doesn't explain everything. And in fact, when you bring up that argument, you're ignoring the second supply and demand line. And what you're ignoring is one of the foundational principles of free market economics, which is Say's law. And Jean-Baptiste Say, Thomas Jefferson called him the best economist of his time, which means he considered him better than Adam Smith. And
Well, Adam Smith, I don't think was still around at that point. Right.
well, I mean, right before
Yeah,
the revolution.
right.
Yeah, but I mean, Adam Smith definitely influenced the founders. But Say was even more important in many ways. And Say's law is that supply creates demand. And this is contrary to Keynesianism, which is and the Democrats are the champions of Keynesianism, which is that demand creates supply. So all the government has to do is stimulate demand, and that'll create jobs. Whereas Say is saying that, no, it's the opposite. When you have a supply that's larger, then that creates more demand. And what that is saying is that we have another guest. We have to be careful when we think of the economy and not label it as a pie, like a solid pie that the government has to divide up and give to different constituents. The economy is a living organism because it's composed of living organisms, human beings, and it's constantly adapting and changing, and and all things being equal, it's also growing. So when you have these new laborers come in, they actually spend the money that they're getting from their job in other places. And then these other businesses have more money, and they expand and hire more people, which bids up the wages. So
well, this seems to be the doctrinaire libertarian approach to this issue of immigration. I would like to see that information more, in data form to see if this is actually the case, because it doesn't seem intuitive to me. But you're on to something. I mean, we should be thinking about this and consider this. I think it might work very sort of as a balance,
yes.
rather than it being dogmatic each time.
Absolutely, and I'm definitely open to considering that, because I know that my foundations in economics are all the Keynesian, because that's what they were teaching at UNR when I took economics. So
you didn't have a choice.
Yeah. So, one thing that I think is worth discussion or throwing into the discussion here is the legal versus illegal. So, if you have legal immigrants who are in the job pool just like everyone else, that's one thing. When you have the illegal immigrants, who are on the side, the corner of the street, and they get picked up for odd jobs, and they're willing to work at a much lower rate than everybody else.
Well, then they're paid in cash.
Right, and they're paid in cash, and it's all under the table. That kind of creates a different situation versus just adding legal immigrants to the worker pool.
Yeah, and that's a function of government in a sense, because government doesn't have the knowledge or the incentives to be able, or the constitutional authority, in my belief, to be setting quotas and so on. And that's why I'm looking for alternatives. I know there are a couple of bills. I believe Rob Portman sponsored one. I don't know who the other sponsor was, that would send back some of the authority over immigration to the states. And I think that's a good idea. But also, it's and of course, they haven't really gotten anywhere, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know how many sponsors they have, but it's the idea behind it that I like.
Well, I don't like that idea at all. I think that is a legitimate federal function. That should not be a state's function.
No.
It challenges the federalism of the framers, that certain functions are to be uniquely at the central government level.
But it wasn't. It wasn't until 1880s.
It's been established that way, and there's been no challenge to it until California came along.
Right, and the Supreme Court is holding to precedents, and the Supreme Court says that the federal government is in charge of immigration, but a lot of people, like our friend on Fox, the judge, Napolitano, yeah, has written essays, Jonathan Turley, I believe. Quite a few people have written essays discussing the issue, but the Supreme Court pulled the first of its penumbras emanating from, rights emanating from penumbras, just like they did with Roe v. Wade, to say that the federal government is in charge when it never had been up until the 1880s. It was always considered a state function. The only thing the federal government is in charge of is uniform rules of naturalization, becoming a citizen, because they didn't, the framers obviously didn't want different states, also slavery. I mean, they didn't want a lot of states allowing citizenship to slaves, so that took a longer time to happen. But the idea was that of selling citizenship, like if somebody came in with $50,000, they could automatically become a citizen.
Well, if Harry Brown were here, he would say that the main function of the central government was to protect us from foreign invasion. Immigration would be categorized as a foreign invasion, from my perspective.
From your perspective,
this is not a military invasion. This is a human invasion, but it still compromises security. And so, I'm sure if Harry Brown were here with us today, he would agree with that perspective.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if Harry Brown would or not, but I do believe that there are other solutions besides the usual solutions of mandates and prohibitions that you get from the two major parties. And now,
or from California.
Yeah, KTHO. So KTHO has an idea that they put out recently on their website, which is an immigration tariff. Instead of having restrictions, and you could have a gold card where people come to work or pay a tariff in order for the privilege of coming here to work. And it doesn't have restrictions, so that, and the tariff, of course, for unskilled laborers would have to be low enough that it would, the coyotes would not really be able to undersell it very much. In other words, in order to get rid of the problem of the coyotes and people trying to cross illegally and dying in the desert, that the best way to do it is if they can scrape together a few $1,000s for a coyote, they could probably scrape together that money for a tariff. And then these people then would be, subject to tax. I think even the IRS code says non-resident aliens are subject to tax, and they would not, they would either not get the benefits, or they, like Medicare and so on, or they could, in order to reduce the tariff, they could forswear the benefits. Now, of course, this is creative thinking, and the two major parties are not known for creative thinking.
No.
So it probably won't go anywhere. But instead of talking about E-Verify, which puts the federal government right in the middle of every hiring and firing decision.
Well, actually, it puts the business in the middle of every hiring and firing.
Well, the federal government is going to be telling the businesses.
Yeah, but I mean, the employer actually has to use the system, which is a burden on the employer.
Yes, it is a burden on the employer.
So that's the unfair part of it, I think.
Yeah, but it's also the fact that there are so many errors in federal databases that it could very well wind up excluding, citizens from working, Hispanic citizens from working, and allow, illegals to actually work, because federal databases are so terribly run.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you, and I think that we would have to make some way of, so like if I go and I apply for a job, I don't have to prove that I'm a citizen, but I think that I should. So I'm thinking that maybe like on driver's licenses or something, there should be a way of noting whether or not this person is a citizen.
But only 2 states currently require documents to prove their citizenship. Kansas is one. I can't
well,
think
and
of that
because
one.
you know you can get a driver's license, like I know in Nevada, you can get a driver's license without being a citizen. Even though when I went and got my driver's license, I had to show a birth certificate. I know that they issue driver's licenses without that.
Oh, that was then, Jennifer. This is now.
So I think that there needs to be some way for everyone to have documentation of whether or not they're a citizen. Otherwise, it's not. Otherwise, it's not fair.
No, I agree, and there should be some documentation involved. Well, we're up against the break, and we'll let our sponsors talk about themselves.
To find out what's hot and happening, join Lady J for Smooth Jazz 2 Hour.
Join me Saturdays, 10 to noon, here on America Matters.
Unable to listen to the whole show? A recording of today's program will be available later today. Visit americamatters.us and click on the podcast link. Now, back to the show.
Hello and welcome back to Reno's Freedom Talk Radio, Talking Truth to Power. My name is Brendan Trainor. I'm your co-host with Leland Faegre and Jennifer Terhune Green. And before we go any further, let's give a shout out to our sponsor, Reno Computer Services. They are Reno's premier IT provider, computer repair, malware removal, and data recovery. And Reno ITT Services will help your business or your personal PC to stay clean and healthy. And they specialize in a preventive approach that delivers reliable, consistent, and secure PC performance. You can reach them at 775-737-4400 or on the web at renocomputerservices.com. So I think...
No, before you move on, I have a logistical problem, not so much a technical one, so I think I'm going to give them a call and see what they can do for me.
Oh,
yeah,
good.
I need to get a file off of an old computer, and I think they can...
I think they can do that.
That's something they can do.
All righty. So also in the news, of course, in the foreign policy is the situation in Venezuela. And most of us that have been following this for a while, the pattern is something we've seen before. We've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in the Ukraine, and the question now is, what is the end game here, and what is the middle game even? Is Donald Trump playing 12-layer chess, like some of his supporters say, or was he talked into this? Is he impulsive and rash, and Bolton and Pompeo and the other neocons talked him into this and told him it would be easier than it probably will be?
Well, you didn't mention the selection of Elliot Abrams, who has not been at the State Department, in his own words, I believe, for 30 years. That's how long it's been since he was there, but he's a CFR member.
Yes.
Pro-war, he's a neocon wing of the CFR establishment. And it's interesting that he jumps on board just as this thing happens. So
exactly.
It's definitely strategic from their perspective.
Yes, he is known for he's a true blue neocon who's known for always being for interventions. And he was involved in the Iran-Contra, where he is convicted of lying to Congress, and he was later pardoned for that. But he's still a convicted liar.
I didn't like that selection at all, but I know where it came from.
Yes.
John Bolton.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bolton seems to stand by those who have similar beliefs that he does. And so we have sent what is basically an economic hitman down to Colombia to oversee the problems there. And what the basic idea is, was this another example of Trump being told, hey, start the problem, and then B, stuff will happen, and then C, we get the oil. But what the stuff is what the crux of the problem, and did they really think through what is going to happen there? I mean, there are 8 to 10 million Venezuelans who are hardcore Bolivarians. The Venezuelan, it's called the Bolivarian movement, and they believe that it worked for them, and they were poor people, and so he has that, and he still has the support of the military, and if the sanctions go into effect, at least the head honchos in the military are only going to get richer. Because
that's always the effect.
Yeah, that's always the effect with sanctions. Sanctions are economic war on the poor.
Hurts the poor. Yeah.
Yep, and
Absolutely.
you know, if we've been accusing them of smuggling cocaine. Well, most of the cocaine in South America actually comes from the hills of our partners, Colombia and to a lesser extent Brazil. And so if they're dealing drugs, they're probably getting it from our partner and in order to deal it. But when you have...
What about Afghanistan? You didn't mention Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, that's NATO's job. That's going to Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And NATO is protecting Europe from the opium grown in Afghanistan.
Sure they are.
But the problem here is that the sanctions are economic war against the poor, and they help the regime. The regime will get richer because smuggling, instead of being just looking the other way when smuggling is going on, if these sanctions continue, the government will actually be facilitating smuggling in order to survive. And if they were making $1 million or so doing smuggling, they're going to reap in possibly billions if these sanctions go on for a long time, and they're going to cause major problems among the poor, starvation, lack of medicine, and so on. And so they rarely ever actually cause the regime change that we're trying to establish.
Although they could get it, and it could be a fairly bloodless one too. But I think what they're really after is the oil.
Yeah.
I think it's always about the oil, you know.
Yeah, almost always.
Almost always.
And that's another thing that's interesting, because how much of a socialist government really was there? I mean, what we had in Venezuela was a regime that called itself socialist, but people are pointing out that they had very little central planning actually.
You're talking about Chavez?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was mostly an oil-based republic where they decided to put more of the oil revenues back to the poor. And I mean, Saudi Arabia is an oil-based republic. You wouldn't call them socialist because they funnel their oil profits back to their people, although the elites in Saudi Arabia have been spending it on wine, women, and song for so long that the amount of revenues that the people are getting has been cut in half over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, I would call it a pittance, really, compared to what they keep for themselves. Yeah. Yeah. It's always like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so all we're going to do, if we continue with these sanctions, is give the regime more power, and also it's going to encourage Russia and China to. And the other countries, now the EU is getting involved with their trying to get around the financial mechanism, the SWIFT and the IMF monitoring, so that they can purchase goods for to and from Iran to the EU. And they were saying that we're going to unveil that, but as of this showtime, it hasn't exactly been unveiled, but it's some kind of special purchasing arrangement that would avoid, these kind of payments. And then there's a lot of talk about the gold in Venezuela lately. Have you?
And where it is.
And where it is. Yeah.
Where it is and where it's going.
Exactly.
Or where it's not, just like at our Fort Knox here. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think, you've really laid out well the issues with Venezuela, and I think the United States and our approach to Venezuela is kind of interesting because, as Ron Paul has pointed out, and others, shouldn't we be taking care of our country and, our Constitution and worrying about our country before we are in getting involved in other countries?
You mean make America great again?
Well, there you go. And,
yeah.
And then, this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. Like, I think a lot of people feel like, hey, this is South America. This is more our area of influence than other countries. But we see a lot of other countries getting involved. And Russia has really stepped in, like we were discussing last week. And Russia is definitely exerting itself here and challenging the United States. And I was reading some interesting articles this morning saying that this is sort of Russia's payback to the United States for the United States getting involved in the Ukraine, which Russia views as their backyard and their area of influence.
So is Elliot Abrams the reaction to that aggression or that perceived aggression? Is that what's going on here?
It's interesting, and I do not know, but I guess Russia has some pretty significant ties to the Maduro regime and definitely does not want the other guy getting in there because they would not have as much influence.
The other Democratic Socialist?
Right. Hey, he's our Democratic Socialist.
Did you want to comment, Brendan, on the Venezuelan constitution?
Yes, it is downloadable. You can find it, and I do have the supposed article that Bolton and others are saying gives us the right to support the other guy in Venezuela. And yeah, and it says the President of the Republic shall become permanently unavailable to serve by reason of the following events: death, resignation, removal from office by decision of the Supreme Court, the Tribunal of Justice they call it, permanent physical or mental disability certified by a medical board designated by the Supreme Court with the approval of the National Assembly, abandonment of his position duly approved, declared by the National Assembly, or recall by popular vote. None of those things have happened, and yet we are claiming that the Venezuelan Constitution gives the other guy, our guy, the right to to be declared the president of Venezuela.
Oh, it's in there somewhere.
They're betting on the fact that nobody's going to go look it up. Only
Right.
a few people out there like you, Brendan, actually would go and look that up.
Yes.
Just like with our Constitution, everybody throws that around, and I really am doubtful about how many people actually go and look it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the icing on the cake is even if all these conditions or one of these conditions are met, they're supposed to hold an election, but in the meantime, the new president will be the executive vice president. It mentions nothing about the
other Democratic Socialist.
Democratic Socialist.
And this was Section 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution.
I know. It's the Venezuelan Constitution is 144 pages long, and I'm sure it grants all kinds of social rights that,
So it lets Bolton and Pompeo claim what they claim is in there.
Exactly.
Effectively.
Yeah. President Macron has got people in France rioting in the streets for a couple of months now, and he's all of a sudden supporting the Venezuelan opposition. It's really ironic what's going on here.
Yes, it is. And we're going to talk about Kamala Harris after the break.
Yeah.
Okay. 2020, here we come.
Getting to the top is more than an engaging memoir. It's a blueprint for success in life.